Hello there.
What a political move to stick two fingers up at Suella Braverman.
Politics at Jack and Sam's is the podcast where we tell you what's going to happen next week in the wild world of Westminster.
My name is Jack Blanchard of Politico, and with me, as always, is the great Sam Coates of Sky News.
Keeping you ahead of the political agenda.
One top civil servant said to me they're 70-30 in favour of thinking something will happen as soon as Monday.
Sam, is it going to happen, yes or no?
Listen to Politics at Jack and Sam's wherever you get your podcasts.
Hi, I'm Matt Barbet. This is the Sky News Daily. For years, the antipathy between Israel and Iran played out across the Middle East in what was called a shadow war. But over the weekend, Iran's ambitions emerged from the shadows, lighting up the night over Israel in that unprecedented and very obvious attack. While this was a key moment, it's been a very long time coming.
It's not for nothing that after Friday prayers, there is the official chant, death to America, death to Israel, every Friday.
That's Sky's defence analyst Michael Clarke will be helping us get some perspective on this latest flare-up and what Iran might do next. But first, let's speak to Dr. Roxanne Farman-Farmayan, who's a former journalist and academic specialising in politics of Iran and the Middle East at Cambridge University. Hi, Roxanne. Thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you.
I'd like to set the context of where we are at the moment. And let's go back a few decades. Let's go back to 1979 and the revolution in Iran, the toppling of the monarchy in the form of the Shah. Is that a good starting point for where we find ourselves now?
I think it's a very good starting point because it is as a result of events from the revolution that has really set the tone for much of what has happened with Iran since. It was a major revolution, one of the two great revolutions of the 20th century, the other one being Russia that became the Soviet Union. And it meant a complete changeover in Iran from being a monarchy with a Shah that was a staunch Western ally to an Islamic republic that more or less was led by Islamic clerical establishment. So I think what happened at the time of the revolution, which was in 1979, when the Shah was overthrown, this came as quite a shock to both Europe and certainly the United States, and particularly because its replacement with the Islamic Republic, which was led at the time by an Ayatollah, which is one of the highest levels of the clerical establishment, Ayatollah Khomeini, who was extremely negative towards the United States and developed a label for the U.S., which has somehow resonated across the decades, which was to call it the Great Satan. It called Britain the Small Satan. And Iran was very anxious to no longer be within the American orbit, very much wanted to form a new vanguard, if you will, that promoted Islamic principles and Islamic ways of approaching modernism rather than the Western way. And that was a signal period for the United States where it realized it was not beloved as much as it had imagined. It heard for the first time that it was an imperial country, according to the way that it was described by the Iranians. So it was a standoff that began with a great deal of hostility, and over the years has only, if anything, gotten worse. And so today, 45 years later, we find that Iran has been sanctioned by the United States for all of that time. And the hostility that was launched at that period has never waned. And from Iran's perspective, in some ways, it's become a very useful way to identify itself differently from the West and also to promote its own principles and policies of developing an Islamic perspective. And it has not supported having the United States move into the region, which it has done consistently over the decades that have ensued.
Let me ask Roxanne, has the US and its foreign policy meant it has unwittingly become that great Satan that Iran calls it? Has it unknowingly lived up to that billing?
The Iranian perspective, I think it has. And I think one of the great threshold moments was when, after very many, many years, the two sides actually sat down together over negotiations for what was called the Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA. And that was an effort to reduce the ability of Iran to develop a nuclear weapon. And in many ways, the Iranian nuclear program had been used as leverage to try to lift the sanctions on Iran. So it had developed this instrument, if you will, to try to convince the West that it could negotiate. And by doing so, perhaps if a nuclear deal was negotiated, sanctions would be lifted. So this was negotiated with the Obama administration, and it was actually an extraordinary breakthrough and a success. And the amount of nuclear production that was going on in Iran at the time dropped to zero, and it was going well. And then Obama came to the end of his second term. President Donald Trump was elected, and he was elected on a campaign to leave the deal because he thought it was a lousy one. So he made good on that promise and tore up the nuclear deal. And that was a threshold, I think, all the way around. Iran felt very much as though it had been betrayed. It was not in breach of the deal. It was, in fact, very much conforming to all of the requirements. And so it was confirmed in its view that the United States was unreliable and could not even keep its promises.
Roxanne, the way you describe the situation, it seems like the Iranians feel hard done to, but the elephant in the room here are the cultural and religious differences. In Iran, they seem to want to suppress argument and oppress people as well at the same time. That has to be a sticking point between the two sides of Iran and the rest of the world, well, certainly the Western world.
Well, it's a very good question. And in fact, that's one of the issues that I think we see dog this whole relationship and our understanding of Iran. Right at the moment, the situation is very dire in Iran. I'm the first to acknowledge that. But I would also like to suggest that in a way, because Iran's been the pariah in terms of the U.S. view of it as a country, it has picked a difficult fight to be on the wrong side of the world's great unipolar power, and a country like the U.S. that has such a domination of many of the media and the principles that we in the West support. The result is that the Iranians have always felt that they were the country everyone loved to hate. And I think one of the issues that Iran suffers from is that being on the wrong side of a very significant power, having been sanctioned for 45 years, Iran has become more and more of a pariah because it has always been struggling. Its economy is in extremely bad shape after all of these years of sanctions. And it's always had to, in a sense, fulfill the spoiler role. It has had to be the country that was always resisting. And to do so, one of the ways it's gone about it is to ensure consensus and repression inside.
At this point in time, what exactly does Iran want?
Very clearly, it wants the United States out of the Middle East. That's probably the highest priority it has. It does not feel as though the Middle East is someplace that the United States has any business being in. And if we look at the record of the period in which the United States had the greatest power, which was from the 1990s when the Soviet Union collapsed till perhaps today, but in any case until after the Second Gulf War that began in 2003, their view is that the United States doesn't belong there and has caused a great deal of conflict. And this is before the current Gaza war. That, I think, is another priority of Iran's, is to develop a neighborhood relationship with the Gulf states and to be able to take greater control over events in that backyard. They have been in phone contact between the leader of Saudi Arabia and the leader of Iran several times over the course of this latest conflict.
With that in mind, Roxanne, with the geopolitical situation being as delicate as you've described it, and daily chance of death to the US, death to Israel, and Britain being called Little Satan to the US's Big Satan, is the situation salvageable right now post that attack on Israel?
From Iran's perspective, it is finding that both the European and the American support of Israel has been so total that there is not much room for access. So this last occurrence with the issues surrounding Gaza, although they have never acknowledged it, the Israelis hit the Iranian consulate in Damascus and killed 6 very high-level Iranian officials and generals there. And the UN did not condemn Israel for doing that. And it simply could have been a condemnation of anyone having hit Iran's territory. And it is very possible that Iran would have acknowledged that that had been recognized and that it would not have retaliated. As it was, the retaliation it made was in many ways considered. It was designed to give lots of notice to Israel and to the United States. They knew it was coming. It was not directed to hit areas of concentration cities. It was not designed to create death. And most of the drones were shot down. And afterwards, Iran said that they considered the situation complete, that they had accomplished what they wanted to, which was to indicate they had the capability, to indicate they were restrained, and to indicate that they had to respond. Now, this is not the way that most analysts would have described the situation. I am describing it from Iran's perspective. And I think that that's an important element for us to recognize that there's always another side of this story.
Well, exactly, especially as Israel is responding saying, well, what would you do if your country had 360 missiles aimed at it? They are encouraging their allies to see it from their perspective. And it's good to hear you describe it from the alternative point of view, Roxanne. Despite Israel's obvious involvement in this, Iran's proxies in Lebanon and Yemen and Syria, and also on the Western side, the UK and the rest of the US's allies, what we're really talking about here is Iran's relationship with the United States, isn't it?
It always does seem to come down to that. Iran certainly has its close relationships with a number of militias. It has a network of allies throughout the region. This includes Hezbollah. So Hezbollah is both a military arm and a political arm of Lebanese politics. It sits on the Lebanese parliament. It has a relationship closely as an ally to Hamas, to the Houthis, as well as to a number of the militias that are in Iraq and that are contributory to the Iraqi parliament and government, as well as, of course, being an ally of Bashar al-Assad in Syria. And I think what we've seen is that's often been described as a proxy network, and they describe it themselves as an axis of resistance. But these are not groups that Iran controls. I would call them very much more close allies, of which it is the largest power in the network. So although I hesitate to use this as an analogy, I think of it a little bit as NATO-like, in that the United States is the heavyweight. It's the one that does the majority of arming, and it has the biggest arsenal. But it does not tell its allies, it does not tell Britain or France what to do. And that's very much the situation with Iran. With its smaller members of this axis. So I think it is important to realize these are not proxies. It is an alliance. And I think we need to understand it that way. It's often the cause of great misperception in the West, how much Iran controls this group.
We're going to pause there for a moment. When we're back, we'll dig a little deeper into what that axis of resistance is and find out exactly what is meant by the crinks. The attack on Israel by Iran over the weekend shocked the entire world, not least because, until now, the conflict between the two nations has always been kept in the shadows, waged through diplomatic channels, sanctions, and things called proxy conflicts. But despite the cloak and dagger, we actually know quite a lot about how Iran's network of alliances works. Michael Clarke, as Sky's defense analyst, you've been watching how the so-called axis of resistance functions in the Middle East. Can you shed some light on it for us?
It works mainly through the IRGC, which is the Iranian Republican Guard Corps, which is a military organization. In theory, it's a military elite. In practice, it's more like a franchise operation. I mean, there are maybe 20,000 IRGC soldiers who are pretty well trained. Some of them are commandos, marines, commanders, and they're as good as anybody's in the region. And then there's a much larger group who are IRGC, but they run insurance companies and hotel chains and, as it were, control quite a lot of the economy. They also, it is said, or it is estimated, they actually get control of about a third of the wealth of the government. So whatever comes into the government is in taxation or in earnings from oil. About a third of it goes to the IRGC to spend on what it wants to spend. Given that they are under sanctions, they have learned over the years how to cope with them. The Iranians found ways of getting their oil out to world markets. They created this ghost fleet of ships that are off the register, which just take oil illegally to other countries who buy it illegally. And that ghost fleet seems to have expanded from a few dozen to several hundred now that the Russians are involved in it as well.
Who's buying the oil?
China, North Korea, and countries in Latin America, and lots of A lot of the oil goes to dealers who then launder it, in effect, and sell it legitimately to somebody else. So there's a whole world out there now of sanctions busting, which Western powers constantly chase but never quite get on top of because there are always loopholes. And the Iranians have been very clever at doing that, and they reverse engineer a lot. So if they get hold of a piece of technology, because it's a very good workforce, very well-educated people, very high technology level, they actually can reverse engineer something, produce a lot of it themselves, very often more cheaply, and it may not be as good as the original, but it works well enough for the customer. And so they've been extremely inventive in getting around sanctions.
This sounds like an organised crime syndicate.
I mean, it's rather like the PLA, the People's Liberation Army in China. It runs lots of civil organizations and in a sense, is part of the government. And the IRGC, a lot of people say, it's the tail that wags the dog, and that the IRGC has undue influence over Iranian policy. Nobody can quite prove that because the way Iran makes policy and the way its constitution works at the top is a real mystery. But the IRGC, they're a force that dominates the politics of Iran, dominates the politics of what Iran does, the policy itself, and they are, by and large, are a very malign influence across the whole of the Middle East.
And it was members of the IRGC that Israel was seeking to eliminate in that attack on the Syrian consulate on April the 1st. Is that kind of situation replicated across the region? You're seeing IRGC commanders in Lebanon, in Syria, in Yemen, pulling the strings?
They don't always pull the strings. They're the big organisers. Because they're pretty expert, they're always well funded, as you would imagine, and they link people together. They're great networkers. And so for Israel and for the United States, they are this malign group who behave in terroristic ways. And some countries have already declared them a terrorist organisation. There's pros and cons about doing that, of course, but they are regarded by a lot of Western countries as effectively terrorists, even though they are part of the official Iranian government.
Because we know they are a part of it and we understand the sphere of their influence with this axis of resistance, why aren't more political leaders just calling it like it is? This is all Iran. This is not Hamas being a separate group or Hezbollah or the Houthis. It's all Iran.
Yeah, I think, well, there's two reasons really for that. I mean, one is a political reason, one is a more technical reason. The political reason is every now and again, as politics goes on, we think maybe there's a chance to get on terms with Iran. Maybe there's a chance to draw the government back into the mainstream a bit more. When the JOPCA, the US-Iranian nuclear deal, was concluded in 2015, there was a sense, well, maybe now we can draw the Iranians back into the mainstream. That didn't work, mainly because Trump wrecked the JCPOA. As soon as he became president, after 2016, he withdrew from the deal. And Iran has gone further and further towards our natural adversaries, Russia, North Korea, and China.
The CRINCs, as they're now called. Tell us about that.
Yeah, China, Russia, and North Korea. And the CRINCs, it's a rather funny name for them, are now mentioned officially in many government documents. So if you look at defence white papers, we would never have named them 20-odd years ago, but now they're named as Britain's adversaries, challengers and adversaries: Russia, China, Iran, North Korea.
And just to finish off, Michael, let's explore how that works, because We saw in the attack on Israel so many drones being launched from Iran, drones that they make themselves, the same brand of drone, Shahed, I think the name is, that are also being used by Russia in Ukraine. They share a lot, these CRINC countries, do they?
They do, and increasingly so now, because the Ukrainian war has changed the politics of it a little bit. So now the Russians are dependent upon North Korean ammunition, shells in particular, artillery shells, in order to keep going. They're very dependent on drones from Iran. You're right, the Shahed 136 is the main one, but the Shahed 131 also, very cheap to produce, about $20,000. So as the Ukrainian war has gone on, the relationships got closer between the CRINCs, because now they're making common cause. The Russians are in trouble in Ukraine. China is helping them. North Korea is helping them. Iran is helping them. And China, North Korea, and Iran are therefore putting themselves further and further away from the Western mainstream. And their argument is, well, the Western mainstream isn't going to be mainstream much longer. We are the new mainstream. There is a new phase in world politics opening, and we are the leaders of it. And in that respect, Iran is putting itself into a camp that it will identify it for the next 20 or 30 years.
Yes, we're in this sort of post-globalization era, aren't we now, post-pandemic? And it all feeds into this idea that perhaps there is a changing in the world order. I guess the final question, Michael, is, are we at risk in the West of only seeing things through our own lens and not appreciating how Iran, China, Russia, North Korea see things in a different way?
Yeah, they do see things in a different way. And you're absolutely right. It's very important that Western publics and politicians and media understand the cultural bases of those countries. They're not the same as ours, and why would they be? And of course they see history differently, and we ought to understand that. But equally, that doesn't mean to say that we give up on the idea of a rules-based system, of the importance of international law, the importance of, decent behaviour wherever possible. Of course everybody slips away from it. Of course everybody behaves questionably throughout history. But that doesn't mean to say it should be the norm. And the problem that we have with the CRINCs at the moment is that they seem to want to throw out everything in international law. They seem to want to create a new order based only on their power, not upon their legitimacy. At least the Western world, with all its hypocrisy, with all that it does wrong, tries to remain legitimate within the rules of international relations that were developed about 400 years ago.
With all its hypocrisy, but this year with all its democracy as well. But that's a whole other conversation, Michael. Thank you very much for now.
Yeah, pleasure.
That is it for today. If you're interested to hear more about exactly what happened in Iran's attack on Israel over the weekend, we covered it all in an extra edition of The Daily. You can find it wherever you're listening to this one. For now, thanks for listening. Bye-bye.